Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. One of the more common questions that comes in about the battles and some of the battles that I've covered in these podcasts are what's the most shocking thing that I've ever come across when researching, a particular battle. And it's not an easy thing to talk about because there were so many incredibly bad things that happened in battle, but very few of them, because I've read so many accounts of them, actually shocked me, I think, the way this did. Imagine standing in a battle line in 496 BC. It's cold, the morning mist is lifting, the drums are beating, and across the field, an enemy army stretches literally as far as the eye can see. You're nervous? Of course you are. You're about to go into battle. Most soldiers throughout history have always been nervous before battle. You wouldn't be human if you weren't. But nothing, I think, can prepare you for what you're about to witness. The army facing you belongs to King Goujian of Yu, one of the most remarkable rulers of ancient China. As the two armies stare at one another across the battlefield, a group of men suddenly step out from the front ranks of Goujian's army. At first, there seems nothing unusual about them. They're soldiers just like any other. Then, in full view of friend and foe alike, they begin shouting their loyalty to their king. Moments later, they draw their swords and they cut their own throats. Imagine the shock. Imagine the silence that must have fallen across the battlefield before a single arrow had been fired or a spear thrust forward. Men were already dying, not at the hands of the enemy, but by their own choice. And as mad as you think it wasn't madness. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of psychological warfare that has ever been recorded. According to the ancient Chinese historian Goujian had selected a group of condemned criminals, men who were already under sentence of death. Their fate was actually sealed regardless of the outcome of the battle, but their deaths could actually still serve a purpose. Standing before the enemy army, and of course they wouldn't have known that these were condemned men, they effectively transformed their own executions into a terrifying psychological spectacle. And the message couldn't have been any clearer. If these men were willing to die voluntarily before the battle had even begun, what kind of warriors were standing behind them? I think to modern ears, the tactic sounds probably relatively grotesque, but ancient warfare, as it was as much a contest of nerves as it was of swords and spears. Armies always fought at close quarters. Soldiers could see the fear in one another's faces. They could hear the panic spread through the ranks. Once confidence cracked, entire armies would collapse. Goujian understood this. Long before military theorists wrote books on morale and psychological operations, he actually grasped a very simple truth. Battles are often won in the mind before they're won on the field. The soldiers facing him suddenly found themselves confronting something deeply unsettling. They were no longer looking at an ordinary army. They were effectively looking at men who appeared to have no fear of death whatsoever. And if an enemy doesn't fear death, how exactly do you intimidate him? How do you persuade him to retreat? How do you break his spirit? And the answer, of course, is that it becomes so much harder to do any of the above. The story, I think, is all the more remarkable because Goujian's own life would become one of history's great tales of determination and revenge. Not long after these events, he suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Kingdom of Wu. He was captured, he was humiliated, he was forced into a position that almost amounted to complete servitude. Many rulers, I think, would have accepted their fate. He didn't. Instead, he dedicated himself to a long and patient recovery. And according to tradition, he slept on rough brushwood and tasted bitter gall each day so that he would never forget the humiliation that he had endured while he was captured. Years passed. While his enemies grew complacent, he rebuilt his own strength, he restored his army, he strengthened his kingdom, and then he waited for the perfect moment to strike. And of course, eventually that moment arrived, and when it did, he destroyed the very kingdom that had once defeated him. His victory was so complete that his name became synonymous with perseverance, and the phrase, sleeping on brushwood and tasting gall, it actually remains part of the Chinese language more than 2,000 years later. Yet even among all the twists and turns of his extraordinary life, it's that battlefield scene that continues to haunt the imagination. Thousands of men waiting for battle, an enemy army watching from across the field, and a line of condemned criminals, over 100 of them, stepping forward to embrace death before the fighting had even begun. It's difficult to think of another moment in military history that better illustrates the power of psychological fear, the spectacle of it. He actually understood that if he could convince his enemy they were facing men beyond fear, he'd already won half the battle. And for one unforgettable morning in 496 BC, it seems he did exactly that. I don't think there's anything that quite matches Goujian's condemned men for sheer theatrical terror. But of course, throughout history, there are numerous examples where armies deliberately used extreme acts to convince the enemy that they were facing warriors beyond fear, if you like. But for me, if I was standing across from warriors who stepped out of line and then slit their own throats, that would do it. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.